Previously introduced as Vanya Hargreaves, Victor Hargreaves was one of the 43 children born on the same day in October 1989. These births were quite a strange phenomenon as the women experienced no signs of pregnancy, and Sir Reginald Hargreaves then adopted 7 of these children. Victor was the 7th child in this lineup, and he was treated quite harshly as a kid before he finally unleashed all his powers. Today, we will explore his physique, powers, and anatomical details in great detail and tell you all about his fascinating physiological abilities in great detail. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. Who is Victor, aka Number 7? Earlier introduced as Vanya Hargreaves, Victor Hargreaves, or Number 7, was one of the 43 children born to women who showed no signs of pregnancy, while Reginald Hargreaves rushed to adopt 7 of them in the hopes that he could train them to save the world. Number 7 was shunned for much of his childhood, and he seemingly had no superpowers. While his siblings honed their telekinesis or super strength, Victor picked up the violin and became a master at it as he came to terms with his identity. He also wrote an autobiography about his experience as an ordinary member of the Umbrella Academy. But little did he know that he held enough power to destroy the entire world. As it turns out, Reginald had discovered Victor's ability to channel sound and convert it into disastrous amounts of energy pretty early on in his life. At 4 years old, Victor harnessed the whistling sounds of a kettle to fatally injure his nanny when she forced him to eat some oatmeal. Later, Victor built a robot named Grace to look after Victor in the hopes that he would at least not do any real harm to other humans. Reginald started testing Victor's abilities in a controlled environment with a fork and some wine glasses, but things got out of control when a storm raged outside and he accidentally channeled its sound into destroying all the glasses on the table. His emotions regulated his powers, and Reginald had a tough time trying to teach him to control them. Eventually, he admitted defeat and gave up on Victor's training, instead beginning to suppress his powers. He believed that his powers were too destructive for the world, and he started medicating Victor to suppress his emotions. He also devised a plan to keep Victor confined within a soundproof vault in the basement, hoping that this would help him regulate his powers. Reginald also enlisted Allison's help and asked her to use her powers to convince Victor that he was just an ordinary child without any powers. Victor spent much of his life believing he was not special until Leonard Peabody finally stumbled upon Reginald's journals and discovered the truth. He then manipulated Victor into unleashing his powers, and due to the intensity of his powers, he accidentally triggered an apocalypse. How does Victor Hargreaves' power of sound manipulation work on a physiological level? Before Leonard told Victor all about his powers, he auditioned for the position of first chair at the Icarus Theater for playing the violin. His performance created energy ripples that floated from his violin and captured the audience's attention, but he was oblivious to his power at this point. Leonard encouraged Victor to go to the Umbrella Academy to invite his siblings to his concert, and the two of them arrived there to discover that the siblings were having a meeting. Hurt by the fact that they excluded him and did not invite him, Victor stormed out of the academy, and his anger caused several streetlights and cars to crash. Well, he paid no notice. He then ended up stumbling across his father's journals under Leonard's bed and finally discovered the true nature of his abilities. However, all of this was undone when Number 5 altered the timeline and Victor went back to knowing nothing about his powers. Later, Leonard invited Victor to his grandmother's cabin in an attempt to get him to use his powers in an isolated setting. He then read all of Reginald's journal entries about Victor's powers after Claus threw them in a dumpster, and he held quite a grudge at the academy since he was not chosen to be one of the 7 despite being born on the same day as them. As Leonard instigated Victor into displaying his powers, he initially struggled, but Victor eventually unleashed all his rage and killed 2 men. He was distraught over the incident, and Leonard stepped in and promised to help him control his powers. Victor's powers mostly involved sound absorption and projection, and he could resonate with sound and harness a significant amount of energy from the sound waves. In this process, his irises and body turned white with a bright light shining from the center of his chest. In some instances, he could channel energy by playing his violin and creating sweeping shockwaves that destroy everything in his vicinity. He also had the ability to direct these attacks at specific targets, and he once demonstrated this ability when he fired a concussive blast at 3 men and sent them flying across a parking lot. Even at his lowest intensity, Victor could cut through human flesh, but in extreme situations, he could harness so much energy that he once even broke the moon apart. What are the effects of Victor's emotional state on his physiological ability to control his powers? Among all his siblings, Victor could cause the most destruction, especially since his powers were linked to his emotional state. In fact, Reginald had numbered these kids according to the intensity of their powers, and Victor ranked last since he was the most chaotic and destructive of them all. He had a hard time regulating his emotions due to his past trauma, and he had not managed to master his power. He often struggled to keep his powers in check when he was dealing with negative emotions, which reflected in his actions as he unleashed huge surges of power without even intending to. He has managed to trigger the apocalypse about twice, but this is not just his doing, as the other siblings also had some role to play in these catastrophic events. Even when Victor was not aware of his powers, he killed 3 nannies as a child just because he was angry that they forced him to eat oatmeal. As he learned more about his powers, he only became more dangerous, and he destroyed the moon and brought about the apocalypse. While he had a lot of trauma over the way Reginald treated him in his childhood, Victor did strive to regulate his emotions as the show progresses, and we can only hope that he will get better with time. What are the physiological mechanisms behind Victor's ability to generate force fields and telekinetically manipulate objects? Victor has the ability to manifest protective barriers that could absorb high amounts of force. These force fields protected him from all kinds of attacks ranging from a blunt weapon to a gun, but the barrier could break if he came into contact with a force that matched his own. For instance, Harlan's force fields were able to repel Victor's, and both of them ended up flying across the room when they attacked each other. In the alternate reality of 1963, Victor used a force field to protect himself from a Soviet tank, and he created a barrier so strong that the round exploded all around him but left him unscathed. In another such instance, he was cornered by the Swedes, and he then generated a force field that would turn into a concussive blast and severely injured his opponents. Victor could also siphon energy and turn it into form of tendrils that floated from his chest. He used these tendrils to suspend his siblings in the air and could also share his energy with others to revive them. He once shared his energy with Harlan to bring him back to life, but he accidentally shared some of his powers with him, and he then tried to siphon these powers back. Victor was also capable of telekinetically manipulating objects by using sound waves to control them. In this way, he could move, immobilize, or constrict objects or people, and he once sent nannies flying across a room by telekinetically moving them as a child. In a fight between Luther and Diego, Victor intervened and unconsciously moved Diego's knife in a way that it would only graze Luther's arm. Victor could send cars flying with his telekinesis, and he once caused the streetlights to go out after he stormed out of his home after fighting with his siblings. In a confrontation with Leonard, Victor levitated him and impaled him with knives, scissors, and glass shards by using telekinesis to summon these objects and leave Leonard hanging midair. He also sent Pogo flying across the Umbrella Academy's living room, and he once telekinetically emptied an entire water body while searching for Harlan. Victor had often relied on telekinesis to get the upper hand in fights, and he once also displayed these abilities against Reginald while confronting him about his childhood. Is Victor, aka Number 7, immortal? Over the course of the entire Umbrella Academy series so far, Victor has not exhibited any signs of having attained immortality. He has certainly displayed great proficiency in abilities such as sound manipulation and telekinesis, and he has managed to stir up quite a storm of destruction with these powers. However, none of these powers grants him immortality, and he can be killed off. What are the other powers and abilities Victor from the Umbrella Academy possesses? While we know all about Victor's ability to manipulate sound, he has also gained enhanced hearing as an extension of his main abilities. He could hear sounds from great distances, focus on a particular sound no matter how low, and harness it to create as much energy as possible. While training in a forest, Victor picked up the sounds of the wind chimes from the cabin to create energy. In another such instance, he harnessed energy from the sound of his own heartbeat to escape the soundproof chamber that Reginald had locked him in. As he grew older, Victor realized that he could hear sounds that were physically impossible to detect, such as a human life's energy. Victor's powers were so intense that he could make lights flicker around him and perform telekinesis on himself to levitate. He would propel himself by harnessing sound energy, and he once demonstrated this ability while escaping the FBI in the alternate 1963 reality. He was also capable of manipulating matter, and he once changed the color of his clothes and violin while displaying his powers. This seems to be an extension of his sound manipulation abilities, as his irises often turned white and his skin tone also turned pale after harnessing sound energy. After Victor shared his powers with Harlan, he performed a telepathic link with him. This link often sent him visions of Harlan screaming for Victor's help, and it was a way for Victor to know when the boy was in trouble. To some extent, Victor could manipulate the weather and cause thunderstorms when he felt sad or angry. When he stormed out of the Hargreaves estate after fighting with his siblings, his emotions caused thunder and rainfall all around the street, and he would sometimes even generate heavy winds when he was feeling blue. In what ways does Victor differ from his siblings? After being treated differently from the rest of his siblings for the most part of his childhood, Victor grew up to be quite insecure. He often doubted his potential and lost his cool over tiny things, and his trauma was quite evident through his behavior. His powers were also somewhat uncontrollable, and he had the ability to destroy the entire world if he was living an emotionally turbulent day. Just like Victor, Luther was also quite insecure, and he strived hard to win Reginald's approval. He is way stronger than Victor, and he was known for his superhuman strength and brute force. While Victor was quite different from the rest of the clan, after enduring a tough childhood, they all seemed quite insecure. Diego was no stranger to this and often tried to go out of the way to display his shooting powers and prove his worth. While Victor could stir up trouble by manipulating sound, Allison was the complete opposite and relied on her voice to spread rumors that would inevitably come true. Her victims were compelled to do whatever she told them, but she had to be in close vicinity to them for her powers to work, as opposed to Victor, who could do large-scale damage from one spot. Victor had some things in common with Klaus, who was also quite traumatized by his powers. He could perform telekinesis and communicate with the dead, but he had gone through so much that he now relied on drugs to cope with ghosts. Ben was quite dependent on Klaus, and he would rely on him to use his powers or communicate with others. Finally, Victor and Five did not seem to have much in common. As the latter had a pompous personality, Five did not seem insecure or traumatized by anything even after having endured a lot, and he would go on missions alone and do whatever he deemed fit. He believed that he was better than everyone else, but his ability to jump through time had gotten them out of trouble many times. Number 7, aka Victor. Major differences between the comics and Netflix series. To state the obvious, Victor Hargreaves' character was introduced as Vanya Hargreaves in the comic series. Victor's story arc was tweaked a bit on the show after the actor Elliot Page came out as transgender, and the show incorporated this detail quite masterfully. In this way, Vanya was a tall, cisgender woman in the comic series, and she had short black hair. When Vanya transformed into the white violin, her entire body turned white while her blood turned gray. In this form, the white violin had violin markings all over her skin, and it is later established that these marks were permanent after being tortured by the conductor. Vanya also only had the ability to manipulate sounds through her violin, while the series counterpart, Victor, could use any form of sound as a source of power. Victor initially had long brown hair that was eventually cut short, and his transformation into the white violin was also different from that of the comic series. In the show, Victor's body emitted blue and white energy that drained all the color from his skin and clothes and turned him white. After Victor ended up slashing Allison's throat, his neck and chest had streaks of her blood all over, which was a reference to the neck markings in the comic. Another key difference between the comic and the series was pointed out during the Dallas story arc, wherein Vanya ends up with amnesia after she is shot in the head. The incident leaves her bound by a wheelchair until Carla Hargreaves steps up to heal her, whereas Victor's amnesia was triggered by getting hit by a car on the show, and it was never seen using a wheelchair. Marvelous verdict. And with that, we conclude our deep dive into Victor Hargreaves, aka Number 5's physiological prowess and anatomical details. He might have had a traumatizing childhood, but he has proved to be a resilient character with a power to bring about the end of the world. He often displays his sound manipulation powers in a lot of style, with things crumbling down as he fiercely plays his violin. We hope you enjoyed exploring the extent of his abilities with us, and do share your views in the comments below. If you like the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.